Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 2nd of August, where I wanted to talk a little bit about the final project for the ending of the semester. And I also wanted to talk about our next two chapters, which happen to be newspapers and journalism. And you'll remember that in addition to the regular journals that you're doing on the media topics that we are discussing, there is also a final project that's due at the ending of the semester, though certainly you can hand it in early if you'd like. And I have the handout that I would have given you if we were meeting in person in the syllabus and other documents folder, which I wanted to just briefly review with you. And that this final project probably is a written analysis of the relationship between media and popular culture, but feel free to suggest other creative approaches for your analysis. This is a media class after all, so if you wanted to utilize media in your analysis, I more than encourage you to do so. I just ask that you run your topic by me, and then we can talk a little bit about what some of your options are. So in the past, I've had students do things like film commercials, for instance, and then they accompany that with some narrative about what it was that they were doing and why, but ultimately you can utilize one of the forms of media in order to examine media. So this could be a very meta project if you are so inclined. That said, there's nothing wrong with the traditional academic paper. And if you do write the traditional academic paper, that would be approximately 4 to 5 pages in length. But that's just a guesstimate, as long or as short as you think you need in order to be able to do a good analysis. Choose any of the topics that I've listed or create your own topic. The following topics that I've suggested are just suggestions. So feel free to adapt, combine, or dismiss. And it always makes sense to briefly discuss the topic with me before you begin any serious composing. And in fact, as you continue to submit in journals and I continue to return them to you, you'll see that occasionally I might indicate somewhere that this would be a good idea for a final project topic. Not that that is necessary. You can always choose something that's different, but if something occurs to me, I will let you know. And if you're quoting from a text, you should use the MLA system of parenthetical documentation. And I'm hopeful that this is something that you talked about in your English 101 class, but we'll also talk about it as well as the semester progresses. Basically, what you're doing is using the modern language association system, where at the ending of a quotation, you're using parentheses. And within that parentheses, you're including some information for the reader to be able to determine where that information comes from. So, again, I'm hopeful that this is something that you've already reviewed, but I also will talk about it as well as we get a little bit closer to the submission date. And please see the syllabus for paper formatting specifications. That basically should be double-spaced, 1-inch margins, a cover page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that lists your name, my name, the paper title, the due date. So again, I'm hopeful that this is review, something that you would have discussed in terms of the MLA. But again, I'll talk a little bit more about it as we get closer to the due date. So possible topics. Media, because obviously this is a media class. So you might want to focus on one particular media, perhaps a music video, a documentary film, a video game, and discuss the message or messages it gives to and about our culture. Or perhaps you want to focus on a cultural group. Focus on one cultural group, teenagers, for instance, or African Americans, or healthcare providers, and discuss how this group is represented in various forms of media. Or perhaps you'd like to discuss a theme. Focus on one theme in popular culture, things like food or beauty or sex, and discuss how this theme is presented in the media. Or, as we know, since we began with advertising is really the glue that holds all of the other media forms together. Focus on the advertising for a particular product, perhaps something like toys or cars or medications, and discuss how that product is presented in the media. You'll remember we began the semester by viewing Jean Kilbourne's work, where she focused on representations of female in media, mostly magazines and television commercials, in order to make her thesis or her contention that female is oftentimes objectified and oftentimes is minimized in the way that female is presented in media, which helps to reinforce as well as create cultural attitudes. The idea of a thesis is something that reasonable people could disagree about, that there could be debate. back and forth, that it's more than just purely stating a fact. So if you are going to analyze, you do want to analyze everything, because we're talking about media, we're talking about more than text. We're talking about images, audio, and all of those should be important in terms of the analysis of the topic in which you ultimately choose. And I've indicated also on this handout one of the ways that you could go about your analysis. You remember at the beginning of the semester we had talked about things like the scientific method and how ultimately you could utilize much of that in terms of your analysis. But if you've ever heard of the 5 W's of journalism, which today's topic is going to be about journalism, so that's a nice connection. The 5 W's of journalism are who, what, when, where, and why. And ultimately, journalism is supposed to try to answer those particular questions. Who is the intended audience or the message of the media that you happen to be examining? What is the intended and also unintended message given to the audience? When are those messages delivered to the audience? And notice that you might have multiple answers here. Where are those messages shown to the audience? How are those messages presented to the audience? And why are those messages important? How do they have cultural impact on our society? You want to make sure that you evaluate the significance of your findings. So, a lot of different ways that you can proceed. It could be a topic that we're talking about in class that you would like to examine further. Perhaps it's a topic that we haven't examined in class that you would like to discuss. Or perhaps it's something with your journals or with your discussion forum questions that you want to pursue. So there are lots of different ways that you can go about this, but I encourage you to begin thinking about it now, because believe it or not, we are in August and time just disappears. It seems like we've got unlimited amount of time when we're in July, and in August it seems like it is pedal to the metal. So I just encourage you to start sooner rather than later, and certainly reach out to me if you've got any questions or ideas or would like any kind of feedback. And while you've got until the ending of the semester, as I indicated, if you can get it in early enough so that I could evaluate it and return it to you before the ending of the semester, you would have the option of revising it for a higher grade. So that might perhaps be some incentive to do it sooner. But moving forward, I wanted to talk about newspapers and also journalism. You'll notice that I combine both of these chapters together, chapter 8 and chapter 14, because journalism is so tied to the newspaper industry. Before I move on to that, though, I wanted to draw your attention to the notes at the bottom of the video, where I have a brief news article for you about books and TikTok, and how TikTok is really reviving the idea of books. At one point, it was thought that books are dead. I am happy to report that local bookstores in particular are experiencing a resurgence, as well as bookstores like Barnes & Noble, bookstores that promote a certain level of socialization, and I suspect that COVID had something to do with that as well. I'd ask you to identify your 3 top culturally significant books, obviously in the discussion forum. Obviously, there is no right or wrong answer here. I was more interested in your thinking. If you're curious about my 3 books, the Bible, which you mentioned, and it certainly is one of the most influential books in our culture, and the Bible in all of its iterations has sold or published more than any other text. So that would be my first book. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which really changed the way that we view not just religion but science and the combination of the two. My third book, and that's also something that you mentioned. My third, I'm cheating because I asked for a book and instead I'm going to give you an author, and the author is William Shakespeare. There's no surprise there since I teach a Shakespeare class. But when we think about Shakespeare's canon, in fact, one of the quotes that I use in my Shakespeare's class is that next to the Bible, Shakespeare's become basically our secular text. So the importance of Shakespeare and his works, even if you've never read them, you probably have some understanding of them, and our language, if you ever take a Shakespeare class, you'll find out more about this, is very heavily influenced by Shakespeare. In fact, many of the common expressions we use were originally created by Shakespeare. So we are oftentimes quoting from him, and we don't even realize But in terms of thinking about reporting, something that's interesting, in the 1880s, it was Nellie Bly, a female, who was known for her investigative reporting techniques. In fact, she reported on mental institution abuses by having herself committed. And that, I guess, laid the foundation of how journalism could really be a vehicle for exposing corruption. The Washington Post did so in the 1970s with the Watergate scandal, and at the time it was thought that that was perhaps the biggest scandal that had ever rocked the United States. Of course, we live in very challenging times right now, so in some ways Watergate pales to what we are living through right now. This gets us to the purpose of newspapers. Newspapers are one of the oldest media forms. After books, I talked about I wanted to try to keep to a certain chronology, if at all possible. And they were in the times of town criers, basically. And yes, they expose corruption. They also are a document for recording historical events. And I do remember the times where people would save newspapers as mementos or as proof of a historical event. Vehicles for democracy. And now we've got knowledge that's being shared amongst large groups of people. We had talked about the early days of books where the literacy rate was so low and the access to books also was so low that very few individuals had access to knowledge. And in fact, one of the things that newspapers can help do is that they can, in many ways, help to indoctrinate individuals, especially immigrants, socially and politically. The newspapers were a vehicle to help immigrants learn how to read, to learn the culture of the United States, and to learn our political and economic systems. Of course, newspapers are an advertising platform, where the bulk of the newspaper would be devoted to ads, and then the copy would be placed around the ads to give you an idea of the importance of advertising in media. And sensationalism occurred because of newspapers. If you've ever heard of yellow journalism, where basically it was a term used from a comic strip called The Yellow Kid. And this is where it was not just exposing corruption, but trying to expose the lurid details of our society, oftentimes not true. And this is something that we will revisit actually when we get to the movie section. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Citizen Kane, a very famous movie in this context. So one of the things that perhaps is a question in terms of newspapers and journalism as a whole is what is newsworthy? And of course, something that's timely, something that's recent. Though, of course, the internet has given a whole new perception of recent, that the newspaper's daily publishing cycle seems quite outdated when we can get news just about instantaneously through the internet and through social media. Proximity, that which is closest to us, oftentimes brings interest, which is why news is so heavy on the United States as opposed to foreign countries. We are a very Eurocentric nation. Conflict, unfortunately, is newsworthy. They learned that early on, that it's the much like the car accident syndrome. You don't want to look, but you have to look. So there is something appealing about conflict. Prominence, things that are considered to be important economically, socially, historically. Human interest stories, though usually those don't take priority, but the idea that we want, news that can be uplifting or inspirational, or at least seem more personal. Things of consequence. So we may not even necessarily realize the import of something, but the newspaper, in theory, and journalists should be able to draw our attention to the import that it will have in the future. Something that's useful. So if you think about things like self-help articles, cooking articles, do-it-yourselves, things of that nature. Things that are novel, things that are different. Again, that kind of appeals to our curiosity. And things that are deviant, which again gets us to the idea of conflict and also gets us into the idea of sometimes yellow journalism. So the history, this goes all the way back to the early days of Rome, where they had news sheets, and then town criers, who were ultimately advertising colonial newspapers. This would be the early days of the United States. The 1800s, so important because of the Industrial Revolution, and the printing press, so important in terms of the dissemination of information, because now newspapers could become a mass media. And of course, the newsprint, the paper in which the newspaper was printed on, was meant to not be permanent. That would allow for a certain level of flexibility because of its impermanence, as opposed to magazines, which is something that was meant to be semi-permanent, as opposed to a book, which was printed in a much more expensive manner, but it was meant to be permanent. But because newspapers were disposable, the idea is that they could be produced on a more regular basis, weekly, even daily, sometimes a couple of times a day, depending on historical events. The Associated Press, or the AP, was the first major wire service for news. In 1846, 6 New York newspapers got together with their telegraph, radio waves, and digital transmissions. We know that we live in the era of fake news and fake journalism, and we know that news organizations have become much more suspect in terms of their motivations and also just in terms of their reporting. In terms of what I think is most reliable, I will still go to the Associated Press. That is my news source of choice. The BBC is also a very good news source. When we think about newspapers, though, in the 1800s, the name that pops up is William Randolph Hearst, who was a media Mongol at the time. And again, we will revisit this when we are in the film section, when we talk about Citizen Kane, which happens to be about William Randolph Hearst, or thinly veiled William Randolph Hearst, as we'll talk about. But if we're talking about our time period, in the late 1900s, we are talking about Rupert Murdoch, who really was the William Randolph Hearst of his day. He's incredibly important because he created what seemed to be impossible. First, this would be the time when there were 3 major television networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. He did what was seemingly impossible by creating a 4th, which was Fox. And how he did it was very clever. He bought the publication TV Guide, which at the time was how individuals found out about what was playing. So he could, of course, promote his own network. More importantly is that he is the mastermind behind Fox News, which I wanted to talk a little bit more about because Fox News is important from a historical perspective in terms of the way that journalism has changed in the last 20 years or so. Now, journalism is the only media practice in business that's specifically protected by the U.S. Constitution. It's supposed to be one of the checks and balances that exists in the United States, that journalists could serve as watchdogs and expose corruption, much like we saw during Watergate. And the idea was to try to achieve objectivity. I've always argued that it's impossible not to have some bias, but at least to attempt to eliminate bias. And the New York Times, for many, many years, was considered the newspaper of record, that newspaper which had the least amount of bias, that tried to adhere to those 5 W's of journalism that I had indicated before: who, what, when, where, and why. And sometimes you would add the how, but that starts with an H, so that doesn't work too well for the W's. You can have different kinds of journalism. So rather than having objective or semi-objective journalism, you could have interpretive journalism, where journalists talk about the significance of the historical events they are reporting in their social context. That was the hope in the early days of 24/7 cable news. Instead, what we see is just a repetition. But ideally, what would happen is that there would be analysis and not just opinion, which is what we oftentimes see now, but real academic analysis about the impact of historical events on our culture and other cultures as well. You can have literary journalism, which utilizes the techniques of literature and storytelling in order to be able to promote facts and information. If you're familiar with the newspaper USA Today, they are credited with creating the importance of using the visual in newspaper, which of course this would be pre-internet. Now we assume that text comes with visuals. That wasn't necessarily the case in the 1980s when USA Today really had its heyday. Online news, of course, we are very familiar with, and what perhaps William, or what perhaps the creators of the internet um, didn't realize is that we wouldn't necessarily be relying on newspapers that would have an online presence, but instead that we would be reporting, or we would be relying on individuals reporting their own perception of the news. And that could be both wonderful and terrible. It certainly opens up access so that we can find out instant information from any part of the globe. But of course, individuals who don't necessarily have a background in reporting journalism are more likely to not necessarily keep to critical standards. And of course, there's always the question of individual bias. You hope that if you're working for a news organization that they vetted you. That's not to say that mistakes can't happen. If you ever heard of Jason Blair, he was a reporter for the New York Times, and he was reporting in the 1990s, in the early days of the Iraqi war. It was one of those human interest stories where he was reporting on a soldier's family. The family contacted the newspaper to say that they had never spoken with this reporter, and there were some basic factual errors in the article, such as the appearance of their home. And the newspaper investigated, and they found out that Jason Blair had never been to interview that family in the Midwest, and there was proof that he was instead in New York having lunch. In fact, because he had charged his lunch to the company account. Not very bright. And that he had done this with previous articles. And again, everyone was aghast that a newspaper of the reputation of the New York Times could have that kind of abuse within it, and there wasn't any kind of fact checking, so that this was allowed for a good amount of time before it just turns out some civilians contacted the newspaper to complain, and if they hadn't, who knows how long this would have continued. National news, as I'm sure you know, is very conflict-oriented. The idea of local news, it was supposed to be more consensus-oriented, that this was a way to build community. But of course, conflict sells. It's one of the things that Fox News was able to determine, and all of the other news sources followed suit afterwards. So even local news has become more conflict-oriented. And local newspapers in particular, especially after COVID, are experiencing severe decline in readership. There are specialized newspapers that target particular demographics. And there's also satirical news, fake news, that if you're familiar with The Daily Show, and in fact, when Jon Stewart was hosting The Daily Show, he was actually voted in 2009 in a Time magazine poll as America's most trusted newscaster. And he discussed how he's not a newscaster, he's a comedian. But of course, now what we've seen has happened with news, or what's supposed to be legitimate news, over the past 10 years or so. Perhaps Jon Stewart was more of a newscaster than some of the newscasters who exist today, especially on cable television. So, some issues about journalism, and some issues also just about newspapers. As I had mentioned earlier, there's definitely an American ethnocentrism involved. The idea of misinformation and fake news, which has become increasingly prevalent over the last several years. The partisanship that has never been as ugly, as bitter, as vitriolic as I see now. And the question of ethics, and does ethics still even exist in journalism? So, this leaves me with my wanting you to watch a documentary that's an hour and 17 minutes long. It's entitled Outfoxed. You can see this in section 10 of our notes below, and the YouTube link is included. Now, this documentary happens to be about Fox News and how they basically came up with, at the time, a new formula for reporting news, one that focused more on partisanship, opinion, and divisiveness. And I don't show this to you to criticize Fox News. I show this to you as a historical document. Because ultimately what happened is that Fox's ratings were so high, and they still continue to be the number one news network. But their ratings were so high that basically the competition felt compelled to duplicate their formula with minor tweaks, which explains how we've gotten to the point where we are today. where we have news that does not necessarily inform. It tries to fearmonger or some kind of entertainment that is involved with fearmongering. And we'll see that it's incredibly biased and incredibly partisan. And that the days of being able to trust a news anchor, whether that be a reporter, you think about again Bob Woodward in the days of Nixon, or a television anchor, if you've heard of Walter Cronkite, who was pivotal in terms of helping to stop the Vietnam War, which goes to show the importance that these individuals had in our society. We no longer have anything like that. So I wanted you to watch Outfoxed, again, more as a historical document, less as a critique of Fox or any kind of political ideology, because at this point we could point to any news network and basically find a similar sort of formula. And the attendance question, which would be due on Thursday, and this is August 4th, for at 1 p.m., and again, if you need an extension, let me know. How do you think journalism has changed since the 2004 documentary Outfoxed? Again, this documentary was done quite a while ago, 2004, so we're coming up on almost 20 years. But how do you think journalism has changed since the 2004 documentary Outfoxed? If nothing else, this documentary will show how influential Fox News was in terms of a presidential election. So it will probably be quite eye-opening. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about media and popular culture. And we're at the point in the semester now where we're just doing an exchange of journals. So you're handing in the journal that's assigned for that particular week on the previous topic that we had discussed, and then I'm getting that back to you on a checkmark scale. And then if you need additional time, you can always let me know. Again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on Thursday. Take care. Bye-bye.